Now, I get a lot of calls from doctors, and and very often it'll be a doctor saying, I've got this patient I've been working with for some time, and they went to one of your doctors or they went to your clinic, and now they're better. Can you tell me, what did you do? Can you explain how you helped this person? And so if I get the permission from the patient, if I'm able to talk to the doctor about the information and get the ethics done, I'll call them back and talk he or she back and describe the lab results, the impact on neurotransmission, and then the question always is, well, what did you do? What was your treatment? The answer is the weapons we use are nutrients, amino acids, vitamins, minerals, amino acids. And at that point, I get these questions really often. They'll say, well, how could vitamins and minerals or amino acids significantly help a person with a major mental illness like schizophrenia or a violent behavior or suicidal depression? And they'll say, don't you really need a powerful drug to get the job done? Well, the answer is, and I would then of course explain why nutrients can have real power. A few years ago, I wrote a book and about all of this, and I spent quite a bit of time trying to decide what to call the book. And I decided the main message I really wanted scientists and psychiatrists and the general public to know was that nutrients have power. So I called the book Nutrient Power. Now, where does the power of nutrients come from these major areas? First of all, we are not born with a lifetime supply of neurotransmitters. All day, every day, throughout our body, we are synthesizing serotonin and dopamine and the rest of them. And the main ingredients or precursors of our neurotransmitters are nutrients. And then epigenetic regulation. I mentioned some of the nutrients. There are several nutrient factors and even herbs and other chemicals and biochemicals that have a lot to do with changing the epigenetics and actually changing gene expression. And nutrients can have a lot to do with that, and that's all really become really well known in the last 10 years. We now can influence and orchestrate neurotransmitter reuptake. We can do the same thing with nutrients that SSRI can do, for example. And then we're learning more and more about oxidative stress. We know that virtually every mental condition we deal with, almost every time you have some level of oxidative overload, too many free radicals marauding through the body. So let's start with B6 as an example. I'm going to talk about B6 and neurotransmission, and it happens to be the major cofactor in the synthesis of three really important neurotransmitters: serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. So I hope you can see this slide. This is the last step in the synthesis of serotonin throughout the body, whether it's in the GI tract, in the brain, or wherever. And by the way, all the serotonin that is synthesized in the body, like in the GI tract, none of that gets to the brain. That's something you might want to know. I heard a few talks so far where people sort of implied that the serotonin in the body actually affected the brain, but it really doesn't, and the mechanisms are a little different. But anyway, this is the last step, whether in the brain or wherever. This is the last chemical step, and what you have is B6 is the major cofactor. This is the 5-hydroxytryptophan becoming serotonin, and the B6 in the form of PLP, or also known as P5P, it's activated B6, and it actually loosely binds to that enzyme and enables this to go, this reaction. So if you have a genetic imbalance, whether it's genetic or however, or acquired, if you're really low in B6, you would expect to have lower than average serotonin around. Same thing is true of dopamine. All of your dopamine comes from L-DOPA. This is the last step in the synthesis of dopamine in the brain and elsewhere. And again, you have an enzyme, that genetically expressed enzyme that enables this reaction. And again, B6 is the primary cofactor. And there have been a multitude of peer-reviewed studies showing that people who have low B6 levels, especially severely low B6 levels, they tend to have low levels of dopamine. And then GABA. GABA is a feel-good, calming neurotransmitter. It's the number 2 neurotransmitter in terms of activity and number of neuron and receptors in the human brain. Number 1 is glutamate, number 2 is GABA, and GABA tends to counteract, it tends to calm neurons. What happens with, when GABA fires, it opens a little pore and chloride ions rush into the neuron and they affect the voltage of that neuron and tend to make it less likely to fire. So it tends to calm people. Anyway, B6 is the major cofactor. So now you've got 3 major neurotransmitters that are really impacted by B6. So that's why B6 is such an important factor in mental health. So we also find mental metabolism disorders have a lot to do with mental function. We find zinc depletion in most of our patients, and that could range from low normal to severe depression, or severely low levels. Copper overload, and I'll explain why that can be so important in so many of these disorders. And then there are deficiencies of calcium, magnesium, manganese, selenium, and a few other metal abnormalities can also affect brain function. But in terms of mental health, we usually focus on zinc, copper, or toxic metals. Overload of lead, mercury, cadmium, and other toxic metals can radically change brain function. So let me talk a little bit about zinc. We have this gigantic database. I had a neuroscience college student with me over a summer ago, and I gave her a database of 15,000 patients of all different types of mental illness. I just had her look at zinc. I wanted to know what's the median that we see in a first-time patient. And it came out 76 micrograms per deciliter. The optimum level for brain function is 90 to 120. And lately, we've been revising that upward. It looks like 90 to 130 might be even better. And what we learned is that nearly all people with depression, nearly all depressives, that's misspelled there, should be depressives and not depression, need zinc, some degree of zinc. And we know the ideal zinc level, and we know the symptoms of zinc. And this is a straightforward medical procedure. You first do plasma zinc, which is known to be the most decisive way to determine zinc status in a patient. Packed cells is number 2. There's 9 different ways that you can do testing for zinc status. The least significant is the taste test, by the way. Anyway, what we do is you first test the patient. You then do your best estimate of what dosage of zinc it'll take to normalize them and get them into the right zone. And then after maybe 2 or 3 or 4 months, retest them, and then see what the zinc level is, and then you can fine-tune the dosage to normalize zinc in the body and zinc in the brain. Well, symptoms help also in the medical history and the diagnosis of zinc deficiency. There's really about 25 symptoms that are associated with zinc deficiency: irritability and anger, poor stress control, poor immune function with frequent infections and often illnesses that are slow to resolve, delayed puberty and growth. We've seen many zinc deficient people who continue to grow after they're 19 or 20 years old if their end bones hadn't sealed yet. They tend to have a sunburn tendency. They, as a group, usually love spicy foods. So when I'm doing medical history, I would always want to ask, well, if you go to a Mexican restaurant, do you put a lot of the salsa on the chips? Or do you like curry and Indian foods? And most people that just love it have some level of zinc deficiency, although there's exceptions. White streaks in the pink of your fingernails is also, unless you've hit yourself with a hammer, it's probably zinc deficiency. And a lot of these people get prematurely gray. And I don't want to go through this slide. This is the important NMDA receptor site. And I just want to point out that zinc helps modulate this receptor. And so zinc is important directly in at least this very important neurotransmitter. Also in GABA. it also helps regulate GABA. Copper overload. One of the first things I found clinically working with patients was that there was quite a few people with very different disorders and symptoms who had really high copper levels. We know what normal is. Normal serum copper is between 80 and 100 micrograms per deciliter. Well, clinical depression, we find 35% of them have copper overload. By the way, most of them are females. We've studied a lot of postpartum depression. We've published a paper on a peer-reviewed journal article that shows that most women who suffer from postnatal depression have extraordinarily high levels of copper, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. 95%. And most of them, if we decopper them, which we have to do very slowly and carefully, most of them report that their depression is gone if we can just normalize their copper. Anxiety, 40%. 55% of people with behavior disorders have copper overload. They're the ones that often are diagnosed with episodic impulsive disorder or have a tendency for intermittent, uncharacteristic anger. 50% of schizophrenics have high copper levels. General population is about 22%, and a lot of the people who have in the general population really don't have a particular problem related to copper. Some of them get along quite nicely, although elevated copper gives you definitely a higher likelihood of cancer. So that's a reason unto itself to try to make sure you don't have elevated copper. Symptoms, number one is hyperactivity. People with copper copper overload tend to have really high norepinephrine and adrenaline levels. They tend to be estrogen intolerant. They tend to have skin sensitivity. Most of them have a problem with sleep because, again, high norepinephrine, high adrenaline, they have trouble getting to sleep. Most of them. They're prone to emotional meltdowns. About 20% have ringing in the ears, tinnitus. Anxiety is characteristic of copper overload and, again, postnatal depression. So this explains why copper is so important. Two of the most important neurotransmitters in the brain are dopamine and norepinephrine. And dopamine is sort of a feel-good neurotransmitter, and we know that we have to have sufficient activity at dopamine for children to learn. And that's why for years people have been giving Ritalin and Adderall to learning disabled children, and eventually they found out what they do is they enhance dopamine activity. Also, this reaction, all of your norepinephrine comes from dopamine. It all happens in the terminal bulb of your neurons. That's where this is all happening in little tiny vesicles that are containing dopamine. And this is the reaction that occurs, and it involves probably the most famous enzyme in human biochemistry, dopamine beta hydroxylase. But notice copper is a cofactor. In fact, it's more than a cofactor. Divalent copper++ actually binds loosely to this enzyme, and that reaction doesn't go well at all unless you have that occur. You also have vitamin C that's part of it, and the vitamin C is there really to keep that enzyme from disappearing. It helps keep it around longer, and the O is needed because if you look at the reaction from left to right, you see that all you're really doing is you're putting an oxygen atom on the dopamine to make norepinephrine. Now, they have done studies, animal studies, where they've taken two different groups of peer-reviewed journal articles where they have examined animals where they starved them of copper down so that they only had 25% of the normal amount of copper in their blood. And then they tested the amount of the amount of norepinephrine and dopamine in their brains. They found something quite astonishing. These are two separate studies. It's been replicated. They found that there's an enormous difference in these important neurotransmitters if you have abnormal copper levels. They found a factor of 3 difference. That's an extraordinary difference. Then, for example, children with, say, ADHD, we find a 68% of ADHD kids in our database, and we've had 5,600 cases, have very elevated copper levels. And so what does that mean? Elevated norepinephrine, that means hyperactivity. What does low dopamine mean? Well, that has to do with the cognitive, the ability to learn. Pyrrole disorder, that's another one of our major key disorders, and really it's a condition that has to do, it's a marker, among other things, for extraordinary oxidative overload. Some people have an inherited genetic version of pyrrole disorder, which has to do with the biochemistry in your spleen and in your bone marrow, and it's a byproduct of some of those important biochemical reactions. And the pyrroles themselves have no function in the body, and the body just clears it out through the bloodstream and then out through the urine. The problem is the pyrroles have an affinity for any chemical that's an aldehyde, and tends to bind to aldehydes and just strip them out of the body. The number one aldehyde in the bloodstream is B6. It's in the form of P5P. And so if you have pyrrole disorder, especially a severe version of it, you are going to be extraordinarily B6 deficient. And then, of course, it's going to affect those 3 neurotransmitters I had talked about earlier. Also, pyrroles tend to have an affinity for and tend to bind to zinc and carry zinc out of the body. So pyrrole disorder usually involves a double deficiency of B6 and zinc. And some of these patients need quite a bit of B6 and zinc just to normalize these levels in their blood. Now, if you've got a pyrrole disorder and it's not treated, you'll tend to have lower levels, reduced activity at serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. Since this is an indicator of, it's associated with extraordinary oxidative overload, you tend to quickly deplete your glutathione, your GSH, and your metallothionein and cysteine and all these other really great antioxidants that we have naturally in the body. It can really help overwhelm that and cause all the problems associated with oxidative overload. And very often, this is, by the way, our favorite imbalance because it can cause really nasty problems in people's mental functioning, but it's the quickest one, it's the easiest one to diagnose. It's also the quickest one to resolve. And we've had many violent children who were violent mainly because of pyrrole disorder who got better within a week or two. So it's relatively easy to help these people. Symptoms of pyrrole disorder: poor stress control, frequent anger. No matter how sweet the personality, if they have pyrrole disorder under stress, they will be prone to frequent anger. They have a tendency to skip breakfast. They're morning people. They thrive at night. They hate mornings. They have very little appetite in the morning in general. There's exceptions, but that's probably 95% of them. They also have little or no dream recall. That's because of the severe B6 deficiency. You need B6 in your hippocampus to process memories. And one measure of that is whether you remember your dreams. Everybody has at least 3 dreams every night, maybe with extraordinary exceptions. Many of them have never had a hint of a dream their entire lives if they have severe pyrrole disorder. And so one of the problems is short-term memory. So these are kids, no matter how smart they are, might have a real problem in school because they might be able to read a few pages, understand it perfectly, but then forget what they've read. So these are people who don't like to read usually, and as adults or even before, they might have to go back to remember what they've just read. It can really affect their academic performance. I'd say about 3/4 of them have unusual sensitivity to bright lights and loud noises. If you take a child to a 4th of July celebration and see the fireworks, and the child just hates it and screaming and yelling, maybe pyrrole disorder was a possibility. Females that have pyrrole disorder have abnormal menstrual periods and very often amenorrhea. They also have a tendency for darker mauve-colored urine, which is how it originally got discovered. In the original studies, they noticed certain schizophrenics had this mauve-colored urine. They found out that what was causing the color was the pyrroles, and they found out that these particular schizophrenics had distinctive symptoms. So that's how it all started about 40 years ago. And then there's oxidative stress. What can go wrong with oxidative stress? How can that happen to people? Well, we're all born with natural antioxidants. Some people have low levels. innately of these. And if you're real, for example, if you have a SNP in your glutathione peroxidase gene, you will be innately low in glutathione, which is one of the major, perhaps the major antioxidant in the body, metallothionein and all the others. And besides that, we know illness, injury, emotional trauma can produce oxidative stress. And it can especially afflict people who have an innate tendency or a vulnerability to that. And then we know also exposure to toxic metals, pesticides, industrial pollutants. There are many different ways in our modern environment that I think we're exposed to more oxidative factors than previous generations. And it's getting worse. We find excessive oxidative stress in about 95%, at least 95% of our mental patients of all types. So most behavior, nearly all behavior, ADHD, anxiety, on and on, patients need strong antioxidant support. Now, in the brain, antioxidant protection is uniquely different, and I call these three factors the three musketeers of antioxidant protection in the brain. Glutathione is the first line of defense. The problem with glutathione is it's not genetically expressed. There's no way for the body to sense that glutathione is low and to increase glutathione. So we can run out of glutathione rather quickly. So the backup system, nature's backup system, especially in the brain, is a genetically expressed protein called metallothionein. And these two work hand in glove. The metallothionein doesn't function unless you have used up a lot of your glutathione, and they work together as a team. And we also know that if you don't have selenium present, enough selenium present, it can reduce the effectiveness of these two by 50%. So I call these the three musketeers for antioxidant in the brain. Now, in the last 10 years, I think we've learned more than I've learned in the previous 30 years regarding nutrients and nutrient therapy and mental illness. And these two factors are all the research on methylation processes and epigenetics. We have new capability now that we didn't have 10 years ago. We now are able to orchestrate and design therapies that can regulate enzyme gene expression. We never could do that before. It's so important. We now can control serotonin reuptake and dopamine reuptake. We can increase these or lower these with nutrient therapy. We can do the same thing that a lot of the psychiatric medications can do. And of course, we now have focused a lot on antioxidant protection for the brain and for the body. So I've got a quote from Maya Angelou that I really like. I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better. So let's talk about methylation. This has been a very prominent topic, and I think all of you are familiar with methylation. Well, there are two types: undermethylation, overmethylation. So I've measured the incidence of methylation in the general population in the United States. I've got this huge database. And we find that 70% of humans, or at least Americans, have normal methylation. They don't really have a methylation disorder. 22% are undermethylated. I'm part of that 22%, by the way. And 8% are overmethylated. It's really important clinically to know what a person's methylation status is. So even though there's only 22% of people who have undermethylation, and by the way, at least half of them do not have a particular mental disorder, we find that in autism, more than 98% of autistics are undermethylated. I was actually the person that first discovered that. In 1999, the great Bernie Rumland found out that I had seen more autistics than anybody in the world and had the biggest database, chemistry, and had me report this to a group of experts in one of his think tanks. And I went through all the chemical factors, and I mentioned that they all tend to be high in toxic metals. They already knew that. I mentioned they tend to have copper and zinc problems. They knew that. They all tended to have malabsorption GI tract issues. They knew that. Then I said that most of them are undermethylated. They all said, what? At that point, nobody had really focused on methylation related to mental functioning. And since that time, world-class methylation experts like Jill James and Richard Deff and others, people who devoted their lives to methylation, got involved, and now this has just sort of started a whole new, you might say, a science unto itself, relating that to behaviors and mental function. I spent a lot of time studying criminals. When I was a prison volunteer, I had in the beginning, I had 125 volunteers, and we were doing the usual naive kind of things that prison volunteers do. But my education began when we started an ex-offender program, and I got to meet the parents that had produced a family that had produced a criminal. And I found that, to my great surprise, many of these families seemed to be ideal, loving, caring families who had other children who were just fine. And they said this child was different from the time they were born. They talked about problems they saw with a 6-month-old and how a 2-year-old might be torturing and tormenting the family pet, and how they were horrified at their own child's behavior. And that's what really got me started wondering whether or not there could be some predisposition for, in this case, behavior disorders. We found that people eventually, after studying 10,000 cases and studying we did a lot of research on them, and we learned that antisocial personality disorder, these are the people we call sociopaths, people with 95% of them are undermethylated. And that's a major part of their issue. They're born with a tendency to be like they are. Schizoaffective disorder, 90%. These are people who tend to have catatonic behaviors and obsessive compulsive behaviors. Oppositional defiant disorders, nearly 7/8. Anorexia and also bulimia, more than 80% have as their primary issue undermethylation. And they usually will get better, the anorexics, by the way, if you normalize their methylation, and in their case, if they have some counseling, usually it gets corrected and usually permanently corrected. Depression is 38%, and that's actually the highest phenotype, the highest type of depression. Well, how about overmethylation? Even though it's only 8% of the population, it's nearly 2/3 of people who have panic and anxiety problems. Paranoid schizophrenia, more than half of them are overmethylated. ADHD is 28%. Behavior disorders, a significant number. And 18% of people with depression basically have overmethylation as their major problem, sometimes their only problem. So you have to be alert for that. So why are some people undermethylated? Well, most of it has to do with genetics and enzyme mutations, or SNPs, mainly in the methylation cycle. And of course, most people focus on MTHFR, which is a genetically expressed, very large enzyme. And it happens to be in the part of the methylation cycle that is the rate-limiting step for the whole cycle. So there's a focus on that. And there are certain SNPs, the 677T, the 1298, most of you are maybe familiar with that are the SNPs in MTHFR that have the biggest effect on the efficiency of that enzyme. There's really more than 100 SNPs in MTHFR, but those two have the greatest impact. And then there's other enzymes, methionine synthase and some of the others shown there. And this is the number one most typical cause of undermethylation in a human being. And it's usually established before we are born. Okay, and there's a few other things that occasionally can cause it. A histamine, some people have genetically an extraordinary level of histamine in their bodies, and that tends to use up a lot of the methionine. And protein deficiency itself, we find this in some people who have a very low protein intake or malabsorption. They can be undermethylated, but usually it's the SNPs.